Shadows fell long across the withered grassland as Griffin O'Connor reined his horse to an abrupt stop on the ridge overlooking a small, weathered cemetery outside Abiquiu, New Mexico territory. The year was 1878, and he hadn't expected to find anyone in this forgotten patch of earth, much less the slender figure kneeling beside a freshly dug grave, her hands working methodically to plant wildflowers around a crude wooden marker. The hot summer wind carried the scent of sage and dust, mingling with the faint aroma of horses and leather that clung to Griffin's clothes. He was trail-worn and weary, having ridden 3 days straight from Santa Fe, chasing rumors of work at one of the large cattle operations near Abiquiu. At 32, Griffin had spent more than half his life wandering the territories, hiring out his gun or his ability to break wild horses, depending on what paid better and kept him moving. He dismounted, his boots landing with a soft thud on the parched earth. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Chance, nickered softly as Griffin led him down the gentle slope toward the cemetery. The woman hadn't noticed him yet. She was focused on her task, humming softly as she worked. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her simple dress, though dusty, looked well made. As he drew closer, he cleared his throat to announce his presence, not wanting to startle her. She turned quickly, one hand instinctively reaching for something in the pocket of her apron. Griffin raised his hands slightly, showing he meant no harm. "Pardon me, miss," he said, his voice rough from trail dust. "Didn't mean to frighten you," she straightened, studying him with careful hazel eyes. "You didn't frighten me, mister, just surprised me is all." Her voice carried a slight Eastern accent, softened by what sounded like years in the West. Griffin glanced at the grave she had been tending, noting the name crudely carved on the marker. "Henry Thompson, 1830–1878. You knew him?" Griffin asked, gesturing toward the grave. She shook her head, loose strands of hair catching the late afternoon sunlight. "No, never met him." Griffin's brow furrowed in confusion as he looked around the small cemetery. There were perhaps 20 graves in all, some with proper headstones, others marked only with wooden crosses or stones. Each one showed signs of recent care: cleared weeds, small bunches of wildflowers, or decorative stones arranged in patterns. "You tend to all these graves?" he asked, unable to hide his curiosity. The woman brushed dirt from her hands and stood fully. She was tall for a woman, though still a good few inches shorter than his 6-foot frame. "Someone has to care," she said simply, her eyes meeting his without apology or explanation. Something about her words and the quiet dignity with which she spoke them resonated deep within Griffin. He'd seen too many forgotten graves across the territory's men and women who died far from home, remembered by no one, their final resting places left to be reclaimed by the desert. "Now I do," he replied softly, surprising himself with the words. Her expression shifted slightly, a barely perceptible softening around her eyes. "You passing through or staying in Abiquiu?" she asked. "Looking for work with one of the ranches," Griffin replied. "Name's Griffin O'Connor." "Phoebe Mills," she said. "I run the general store in town with my uncle." She gathered her tools, a small trowel and a canvas bag that appeared to hold seeds and plant cuttings. "Sun's going down soon. If you're heading to town, you might as well ride alongside me." Griffin nodded, oddly pleased by the invitation. He helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her, keeping a respectful distance as they rode the mile into Abiquiu. The town was small but sturdy, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures that had sprung up to serve the ranches in the surrounding countryside, and the travelers passing through on their way to Santa Fe or Colorado. Phoebe directed him to a modest 2-story building with Mills General Merchandise painted across the front. A weathered old man sat on the porch, smoking a pipe. He eyed Griffin suspiciously as they approached. "This is my Uncle Walter," Phoebe said as they dismounted. "Uncle, this is Mr. O'Connor. He's looking for ranch work." Walter Mills grunted in acknowledgement. "Try Sanderson's place, about 5 miles north. Heard he lost some hands to that mining outfit up in Colorado." Griffin tipped his hat in thanks. "Much obliged." "Is there somewhere in town I might get a room for the night? Mrs. Holloway runs a boarding house down the street," Phoebe offered. "Tell her I sent you." As Griffin prepared to lead Chance away, Phoebe added, "I go to the cemetery every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, Mr. O'Connor. If you're still around and feel inclined to help, I wouldn't turn it down." There was something about the way she said it, not a plea or a flirtation, just a simple statement of fact that made Griffin pause. "I'll keep that in mind, Miss Mills." The next day, Griffin rode out to the Sanderson ranch and secured work as a horse trainer. Jack Sanderson, a gruff man in his 50s who'd built his ranch from nothing, seemed pleased to find someone with Griffin's experience. The pay was fair, the bunkhouse clean, and the other hands respectful enough to mind their own business. But as Friday approached, Griffin found himself thinking about Phoebe Mills and her cemetery of strangers. He couldn't explain the pull he felt, even to himself. Perhaps it was the unexpectedness of finding someone who cared for those forgotten by the world. Perhaps it was the quiet strength he'd glimpsed in her eyes. On Friday afternoon, he asked for a few hours off and rode back to town. He found Phoebe just leaving the general store, a basket of tools and seedlings in her arms. "Miss Mills," he called, dismounting in front of the store. She turned, surprise evident on her face before it gave way to a small smile. "Mr. O'Connor, I see you found work." "At Sanderson's, yes." He gestured to her basket. "Heading to the cemetery," she nodded. "You still offering to help?" "I am." They walked together this time, leading Chance behind them. The afternoon was hot, but a gentle breeze made it bearable. As they walked, Griffin found himself asking the question that had been on his mind since their first meeting. "Why do you do it? Tend to strangers' graves?" Phoebe was quiet for a moment, her free hand reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "My brother died in the war," she finally said. "Confederate side, we never found out where he was buried. I like to think someone somewhere is doing for him what I do for these folks." Her simple explanation struck Griffin deeply. He had lost a younger brother too, not to war but to a sudden fever when they were boys. The memory of the small grave back in Missouri remained one of his clearest childhood recollections. "That's a kindness," he said quietly. At the cemetery, Phoebe showed him how she cared for each grave, clearing debris, pulling weeds, occasionally repairing a marker that had fallen. They worked side by side through the afternoon, and Griffin found the labor surprisingly satisfying. There was something peaceful about tending to these final resting places, honoring lives that had ended far from home. As the weeks passed, Griffin fell into a routine. He worked at the Sanderson ranch from Sunday through Friday morning, then rode into town every Friday afternoon to help Phoebe at the cemetery. Their friendship grew gradually, built on shared labor and quiet conversation. He learned that she had come west with her uncle after the war, leaving behind a Virginia that no longer felt like home. She was 27, unmarried, and seemingly content with her life in Abiquiu. She ran the store's books, knew every family in the county, and occasionally taught reading to the local children. In turn, he told her about his years drifting across the West, the cattle drives in Texas, the brief stint as a deputy in Kansas, the winter he'd spent trapping in Colorado. He didn't mention the darker parts of his past, the gunfights he'd survived, the men he'd killed, the nightmares that sometimes woke him. But somehow, he sensed she understood there was more to his story than he was sharing. One Friday in late August, they finished their work earlier than usual and sat in the shade of a gnarled juniper tree at the edge of the cemetery. Phoebe had brought a small lunch, fresh bread, cheese, and apples which they shared as they looked out over the valley. "Can I ask you something personal?" Phoebe said, breaking a comfortable silence. Griffin nodded, curious. "Why have you stayed in Abiquiu? You don't strike me as a man who settles in one place for long." The question caught him off guard, not because it was presumptuous, but because he hadn't fully examined his own reasons. He'd had offers to move on a cattle drive heading to Wyoming had passed through 3 weeks back, and the trail boss had tried to hire him away from Sanderson. "I suppose I found something worth staying for," he said after a moment, his eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away. A slight flush colored her cheeks, but she didn't shy away from his implied meaning. "And what might that be, Mr. O'Connor? I think you know," he replied softly. "And I believe it's time you called me Griffin." "Griffin," she repeated, testing the name. Then you should call me Phoebe. Something shifted between them that afternoon, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since their first meeting. When he walked her back to town, their hands brushed once, twice, and then he found her fingers twined with his, a simple touch that felt more significant than any he could remember. The following Tuesday, Griffin arrived at the cemetery to find Phoebe already there, kneeling beside a fresh grave. The marker was new, the name unfamiliar to him. Elena Vasquez, 1855–1878. What happened? He asked, joining her. Childbirth, Phoebe said quietly. Her husband works at the Morales Ranch. The baby survived a boy. She arranged a small bouquet of late summer wildflowers at the base of the marker. He brought her here yesterday. Said his wife always liked this place, how it was peaceful and cared for. Griffin helped her finish planting flowers around Elena's grave, then they moved on to tend the others. As they worked, he watched Phoebe from the corner of his eye, struck by the gentle care she showed to each grave, the quiet respect in her movements. In that moment, he realized he was falling in love with her, not in the desperate, passionate way he'd experienced in his younger days, but in a deeper, steadier fashion that felt both unfamiliar and right. That evening, as they walked back toward town, Griffin gathered his courage. "Phoebe, would you allow me to call on you properly? Perhaps Sunday after church." She looked up at him, her expression serious but warm. "I'd like that, Griffin." Word traveled fast in a small town like Abiquiu. By the time Griffin arrived at the Mills home that Sunday, wearing his one good shirt and carrying a small bouquet of flowers he'd gathered from the meadow near the ranch, it seemed half the town knew he was courting Phoebe Mills. Uncle Walter answered the door, giving Griffin a long, assessing look before allowing him inside. "She's a special woman, my niece," he said gruffly. "Not like most." "I'm well aware of that, sir," Griffin replied with sincerity. Over the next few months, their courtship progressed steadily. Griffin joined Phoebe and her uncle for Sunday dinners. They attended the occasional town dance together. And every Tuesday and Friday, they tended the cemetery, a ritual that had brought them together and now served as the foundation of their deepening relationship. As autumn turned the cottonwoods along the River Golden, Griffin began to think about a future he had never before considered. He had savings, not much, but enough to make a start. Sanderson had hinted that he might be willing to sell a small parcel of his land to Griffin if he wanted to establish his own modest ranch, but doubt gnawed at him. Phoebe deserved better than a man with his past, a drifter who had spent years taking whatever work came his way, including jobs that required a quick draw and steady nerve. She was respected in Abiquiu, educated, with roots and a place in the community. What did he have to offer her except a life of uncertainty? These thoughts weighed on his mind one Friday in early October as they worked together at the cemetery. Phoebe noticed his unusual quiet. "What troubles you?" she asked, sitting back on her heels beside a grave she was clearing of fallen leaves. Griffin hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm not the man you think I am, Phoebe." She raised an eyebrow. "And who do I think you are? Someone worthy of your regard." He met her gaze directly. "I've done things I'm not proud of, been places a lady like you shouldn't hear about." Phoebe set down her trowel and stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. She walked to where Griffin was standing and looked up at him with clear, steady eyes. "You think I don't know there's darkness in your past? That I haven't seen the way your hand still drifts to your hip sometimes when you're startled, or notice the scars you try to hide?" She reached up, her hand gentle against his cheek. "We all have pasts, Griffin. What matters is who you choose to be now." Her words hit him with unexpected force. For years, he had defined himself by what he had done, where he had been, the mistakes he had made. The idea that he could choose a different path, that his past didn't have to dictate his future, was both terrifying and liberating. "I want to be someone who deserves you," he said softly, covering her hand with his own. "You already are," she replied, and when she stretched up to kiss him, it felt like absolution. That night, riding back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, Griffin made his decision. He would build a life here with Phoebe if she would have him. It was time to stop drifting and plant roots of his own. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 weeks later, Word reached Abiquiu that a band of outlaws had robbed the bank in Santa Fe and were headed north, possibly through their territory. The local sheriff, an aging man named Barton, called for volunteers to help patrol the roads and protect the town. Griffin joined without hesitation, along with several other ranch hands and townsmen. For 3 days, they took shifts watching the approaches to town. On the 4th day, Griffin and 2 other men were checking the northern road when they spotted dust on the horizon riders approaching fast. "Looks like 5 of them," said Tom Hansen, a blacksmith's apprentice who had volunteered alongside Griffin. Griffin narrowed his eyes, assessing the situation. "Ride back to town. Tell Sheriff Barton they're coming from the north. Mike and I will try to slow them down." Tom galloped back toward Abiquiu while Griffin and Mike Patterson, a rancher's son, positioned themselves behind a rocky outcropping overlooking the road. They didn't have to wait long before the riders came into view, hard-looking men pushing their horses at a dangerous pace. "Hold it right there." Griffin shouted when they were within range, stepping into view with his rifle raised. "This road's closed." The outlaws reacted instantly, drawing weapons. Griffin fired a warning shot over their heads, but the lead rider responded by shooting directly at him. The bullet whistled past Griffin's ear as he ducked behind the rocks. What followed was a brief but intense exchange of gunfire. Griffin's experience showed he remained calm, took careful aim, and managed to wound 2 of the outlaws. Mike proved himself a steady hand as well, keeping up a consistent covering fire. The outlaws, realizing they had lost the element of surprise and finding the path blocked, eventually retreated, circling away to the east to find another route. Griffin and Mike mounted up to follow at a distance, making sure they were truly leaving the area. By the time they returned to town, the sheriff had organized the remaining volunteers into a defensive perimeter. The town was on high alert, with businesses closed and families staying indoors. Griffin found Phoebe at the general store, helping her uncle board up the windows. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes quickly scanning him for injuries. "Fine," he assured her. "They've headed east for now, but they might circle back. You should stay inside." For the next 2 days, the town remained on edge, but the outlaws didn't return. News eventually reached them that a larger posse from Santa Fe had caught up with the band near Las Vegas, capturing 3 and killing 1, with the final outlaw still at large. Life in Abiquiu gradually returned to normal, but the incident had changed something for Griffin. He had defended this town, Phoebe's town, without hesitation, had risked his life to protect it. And in doing so, he realized that somewhere along the way, it had become his town too. The following Sunday, after church, Griffin asked Phoebe to walk with him. They strolled to the edge of town, where the road led out toward the cemetery and the open country beyond. The November air was crisp, the sky a clear, endless blue. "I spoke with your uncle yesterday," Griffin said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I asked his blessing to marry you if you'll have me." Phoebe's step faltered, her eyes widening as she turned to face him. "And what did he say?" "He said I'd better be prepared to learn the mercantile business, because he's getting too old to mind the store all day." Griffin smiled slightly before his expression grew serious again. "I love you, Phoebe. I never thought I'd find a home again, not after all these years wandering. But you've made me believe it's possible." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring, nothing fancy, just a simple silver band with a modest pearl. He'd ridden all the way to Santa Fe to buy it, using nearly all his savings. "I don't have much to offer yet," he continued. "But Sanderson's agreed to sell me a small piece of land. Good water rights, enough pasture for a decent start. I thought maybe we could build something there, a home, a future, if that's what you want." Phoebe looked at the ring, then back at Griffin's face. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Ask me properly, Griffin O'Connor." Griffin went down on one knee right there on the dusty road, holding the ring up to her. "Phoebe Mills, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, her smile brighter than the New Mexico sun. "Yes, I will." They were married in the small church in Abiquiu on Christmas Eve, 1878. The building was decorated with pine boughs and candles, and despite the winter chill, it was filled to capacity. It seemed the entire town had turned out to see the union of the quiet, kind-hearted woman who tended strangers' graves and the former drifter who had found his place among them. Phoebe wore a dress of deep blue silk that had been her mother's, altered by the skilled hands of Mrs. Holloway from the boarding house. Griffin, almost unrecognizable in a new black suit, waited for her at the altar, his face a mixture of awe and happiness as she walked toward him on her uncle's arm. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, a promise to cherish and support one another through whatever life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Griffin kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought sighs from even the most stoic members of the congregation. The celebration afterward was held at the town hall, with tables groaning under the weight of dishes contributed by nearly every household in Abiquiu. There was music and dancing, laughter and tears, as the community celebrated not just a wedding but the cementing of Griffin's place among them. Late that night, after the last guests had departed and they had retired to the small house Griffin had been building on his newly acquired land, Phoebe stood by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Happy?" Griffin asked, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. She leaned back against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible." In the years that followed, Griffin and Phoebe built a life together that exceeded both their dreams. Their small ranch prospered, growing from a modest beginning to a respectable operation with a herd of quality horses that buyers came from as far as Colorado to see. When Walter Mills decided to retire fully, they took over the general store as well, dividing their time between the two enterprises. Their family grew too. Their first child, a son they named James Walter O'Connor, arrived in the fall of 1880, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth. In 1886, they welcomed twins Michael and Margaret, completing their family. Through it all, they continued the tradition that had brought them together. Every Tuesday and Friday, weather permitting, one or both of them would visit the cemetery to tend the graves. As their children grew old enough, they joined in the ritual, learning from their parents the importance of remembering those who might otherwise be forgotten. The cemetery itself expanded over the years. New graves added as Abiquiu faced its share of hardships, a diphtheria outbreak in 1882 that took 5 children. A flash flood in 1885 that claimed 3 ranch hands, the inevitable passings of the town's older residents. Each new grave received the same care as the old ones, marked and maintained, remembered. On a warm Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1898, Griffin and Phoebe walked hand in hand through the cemetery. 20 years of marriage had silvered Griffin's once dark hair at the temples and added laugh lines around Phoebe's eyes, but the connection between them remained as strong as ever. They stopped beside a newer section where several graves bore the dates of the recently concluded Spanish-American War. James, their oldest, had enlisted and served, returning home safely to his relieved parents and his young wife. Others from the county had not been so fortunate. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if I hadn't ridden by that day?" Griffin asked. Squeezing Phoebe's hand gently, she looked up at him, the love of 2 decades shining in her eyes. "I believe we were meant to find each other, Griffin. Some things are written in the stars long before we understand them," he smiled, pulling her close for a moment. "A cemetery seems like an unlikely place for a love story to begin." "Perhaps," Phoebe agreed, "but it makes a certain kind of sense. In a place where life ends, something beautiful began." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the peaceful ground, Griffin and Phoebe continued their work not just tending graves now, but nurturing the living memory of a community and the love that had grown between them in this unexpected place of care and remembrance. And in the soft evening light, among the markers of those long past, the simple words that had started their journey echoed still. "Someone has to care. Now I do."